chance to have so many people here. And I also want to tell you that our speaker tonight is Dr. Noreen Higgins, McHugh. She's talking about this wonderful book that she has written, The Revolutionary Women of Tipperary, 1914-23. Now, copies of those books are on sale here, and they can be had from Noreen later on in the night. And of course it's the story of Cumann in Tipperary and East Limerick. And this book has achieved much acclaim, both locally and nationally. It has won the Tipperary Book of the Year prize. That's all I can say. Noreen is a very respected historian and researcher. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'll hand you over now to Noreen Higgins McHugh for a long time.
Well, this for you for later was the fodder quick on the show. So I just want to ask, do I need to stand in front of the microphone?
Yes. Okay,
I'll stand in front of the microphone then. Okay, so I'll stand in front of the microphone for those people who might find it, or I can take it out. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'll try and make, right, so basically the detail is in the book. So this will be an overview of Cumann. So when I did the book, what I have done here is this, when I wrote it, first of all I wrote the book because there's no other book like that I wanted. I couldn't find the book I wanted to read, so I ended up writing it. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is that there's 200 pages of narrative, which I'm going to explain to you now. And then there are 7 appendices. So what I got the information from was from the Bureau of Military History and the Irish Military Records, Irish Military Archives. And I extracted from them 401 pension applications from women of all of Tipperary, plus another 35 or 6 then from East Limerick. So that's why it became so big. Okay, so we'll go on to the next bit then, please. Okay, so Cumann starts, right, so I'll have to go through this very quickly, so I'm just going to try and set the scene. One of the things that really struck me, and it's kind of irrelevant, but it then is relevant, so is that if you read all of the military barracks, the British Army barracks that were in Tipperary, it's quite astounding at the time, around 1900 and even 1920. There was a military barracks of about 1,500 men in Nina. There was a very small military barracks in Roscrea, which was actually closed around 1922, and then it was opened up for the Civil War. No military barracks in Thurles, presumably because of the influence of the Ursulines. Another huge military barracks, which the Garda College is there now in Tipperary, 1,500. Another 1,500 expanded to 4,000 men down in Tipperary town, 200 men at the military barracks in Cashel, 200 men in the military barracks in Featherd, 1,500 men down in Cahir, 1,500 men in Clonmel. We're looking at about 5,000 or 6,000 men belong to the British Army just in Tipperary. And you're looking at 77 RIC stations. So Tipperary was really very, very militarised at the time. And it's amazing there was even a war of independence. That's the point. Okay, so when we look at the early 20th century in Ireland, we're looking at a group of people who have been listening non-stop to Home Rule by Parnell. And it starts in 1885, doesn't work, it starts in 1893, doesn't work, and Redmond Parnell then dies around in the 1890s, 1891, and then what happens then in the early 1900s, we're still talking about Home Rule, but there's a cultural revolution happening as well with the Gaelic League, and that eventually sort of all crystallises into an attitude that we need to get a Home Rule and maybe more independence for Ireland. And so you read up then to about 1912, and in 1912 the Home Rule Act is passed. And the Ulster Unionists react to that, and they start the Ulster Volunteers. Then what happens in the south is the Irish Volunteers start up. The Irish Volunteers then are the men's organisation. And that first lecture then was held, our first meeting was held in November 1913. And at that meeting, Owen McNeill, who was actually the grandfather of Michael McDougall, he was in government there a number of years ago, he turns around and he says, there will be work for the women to do. And that starts off Cumann then in 1914 in Wynn's Hotel. And this is an advertisement for it. And their aims for Cumann was to advance the cause of Irish liberty, to organise Irish women in furtherance of the objective, to assist in arming and equipping a body of Irish men, and to establish a fund for these purposes. And essentially the concept of Cumann was that they would raise funds to arm the men, funds to buy guns, funds to buy ammunition. And they did that in a huge amount of ways. They held jumping sales, they held cake sales, they held areas, which would be kind of an Irish day. A lot of them donated quite a lot of their own money. They collected subs from people outside Mass. They collected subs from house-to-house subscriptions. And the whole thing was to arm the volunteers. The women generally did not. They were storing the guns, they were minding the guns, they were giving out the guns, but they usually didn't use them. And to be honest, a lot of the volunteers didn't either. Simply there was a shortage of guns. So Cumann, the first meeting then was held in Winds Hotel in 2nd of April 1914. Only 100 women actually attended, because it was held at 4 o'clock and hadn't been properly advertised. And equally, we were talking about a population who are not used to women being politically active. So that was why it was a very small attendance. The 6 months before, when the Irish Volunteers had their first meeting, 1,000 men attended. 3,000 inside in a place called the Ring up in Dublin, and 4,000 in the grounds. So you can see the disparity. Go on. Right, the impact of World War I cannot be overemphasised in the whole period of the Irish Revolution. First of all, it militarises society. Say, for instance, the Tipperary military barracks had 1,500 men in it in 1914, but by 1917 and 1918 it had about 4,000 men, most of them wounded in the war. It affects Ireland and affects women quite a lot, because it's the first time that women are sort of told to come out from the home. They're encouraged to, if you like, they're encouraged in a voluntary sense to join the British Army and act as nurses. And then by 1917 and 1918, they're acting as drivers, bus drivers, canteen workers, working in telephone exchanges, working in communications, transport, and all of that impacts on the concept of women having jobs, and it does impact on Cumann that they can do more than fundraising and have other activities. World War I also affects, these are just pictures from World War I. In Tipperary town at the moment we have 2 statues. One is of a lady who is, she was the first special in Ireland, I'll think her name in a moment, and the other lady then is a Cumann woman, and they're both contemporary, and it's just illustrating the difference of how women are treated during World War I. World War I is also very important because the next thing it does is it explains the reactions of the British to the Rising. There were so many executions. It also explains why, if you like, the revolutionary years did happen at that time. There was no immigration. You couldn't leave to go to America, so all these young people are left in Ireland. It also affected the voting patterns in Ireland, because there was no elections held during those years. So when I talk about the 19 election, I'm talking about an election for the first time since 1911. So it impacted the whole country in a huge amount of ways, and also there was also a concept, if you like, in World War I of the blood sacrifice, and also then Padraig Pearse had it as well. So the other way it affected Cumann and it affected the Irish Volunteers was it caused a split in both movements. Those who were left, both organisations split. Both organisations, the majority of the women in Cumann said, yes, we're going to support the British in a war effort. This is a world war. And it was, all of Europe was involved, and then it spread across, of course, quite a bit of Asia and Africa, because they were belonging to those empires. And those who were left in Cumann did not want to be involved in World War I, neither did the volunteers, and they were saying, we're here for the defence of Ireland only. So we were left with the people then who were completely interested in just Irish independence and only going to fight for Ireland as members of Cumann and as members of the Irish Volunteers. Right, we'll go on to the next one. Right, this is the structure of Cumann, and this is the uniform which I brought from the Excel. So if you like, this uniform is a replica. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can go louder if you want, it's no problem. So what happens is, this is the Donegal tweed. It is the female equivalent of the uniform that the men wore. Now, when I'm talking about the Irish Volunteers, and I'm also talking about the IRA, I'm talking about a guerrilla army. So when you join a regular army, and I'd just like to make a point, when you join a regular army, you'll be supplied with the uniform. You're also given the canteen services. You're given the accommodation services. You're given your gun. You're given everything. But with a guerrilla army, you don't get any of that. And it would be my contention that Cumann supplied a lot of those facilities to the IRA, particularly during the War of Independence. They supplied the canteen services, they supplied the accommodation, they stored the guns, they transported the guns, they did the funeral services, they did the hospital services, and they also repaired the uniforms. So the men had to buy their own uniforms, and so had the women. So the women, it's the very same as the men's uniform, except as a skirt. And it was regulation that the skirt had to be 7 inches above the ground. And then, unfortunately, I didn't bring it tonight, there was a little badge with the Cumann badge, which you can see at another file in a moment. And there was also a hat. And the hat was a slouch hat, and you can see them there marching. If you look at the picture there, it was actually a hard hat at one stage, and then the hat changed. So some women bought their uniform, but most of them actually were able to get a pattern from Dublin, from headquarters, and went home, bought their material, and made their uniform, as did quite some of the men. Is that okay? Now, the structure of Cumann, you had an executive in Dublin, which changed over the years. It was about 10 women, first of all middle class, all quite old, all married, in comparison to the younger women who were in their teenage years, and also their very early 20s in Cumann down the country. And the problem, what happened then was, as the years went by, the executive got bigger and bigger. And you had a lot of the widows of 1916, like Mrs. Pearce on the committee of Cumann, as Kathleen Clark was also involved in Cumann. An interesting part of Cumann when I was doing it was, I discovered it wasn't just an Irish organisation. Those who had immigrated to America and England and Australia actually had branches of Cumann. And they also sent money to Ireland to buy guns and also for the various activities of Cumann, which was to support the prisoners and also support the dependents of the 1916 Rising. In the equivalent of the men had the IRA and the Irish Volunteers in Ireland, and then they had Clan na Gael over in England, over in America, and then they had the IRA also in England. But it was actually one organisation for Cumann. And I listed those members, I've listed those branches that I could find in my book from the UK, USA and Australia. Then there was involved in the county series. And then each county then was divided into brigades, except in Cumann the brigades were called DCs. So in Tipperary with the 1st Brigade, 1st DC, 2nd Brigade, which is this area, and then you had the 3rd Brigade. And then each branch had a captain, secretary, treasurer and members. At one stage it was called President, Secretary, Treasurer and members. And then around 1921 they got more military status, and instead of being a branch it was called a company. And then they had a captain, and then they had a 1st Lieutenant, and then a quartermaster, because it was kind of hoping to emulate a military organisation. We'll go on to the next one, Johnny, because I take too long of this. Right, so what happens then is Cumann lose numbers in 1914, and it's kind of based in the main Dublin areas. There is a branch in Nina and in Clonmel in 1914. Jenny Weiss-Power, who had been involved in the Land League, and she was a founder member of Cumann, she founded the branch in Nina. And down in Clonmel area was a lady called Mary Cooney. She founded all the branches down there. And she was at this kind of most nights of the week, and then preparing for it on Sunday. So we'll just briefly mention the women in 1916 Rising. The Rising did not happen in Tipperary, but the women of the McHugh family who were over in Anfield, they were involved in sort of the uprising in Tipperary, in that the men went out on the hills in Tipperary for the 1916 Rising around that area, stayed out all week. Some of them were arrested afterwards, but they didn't really actively take part. They were hoping to take part. The men cut down communication signals, and they were waiting for the word from Dublin, but it never really came off. So the women were involved in 1916. There was about 150 to 200 women involved. Countess Markovich is coming to the fore. She and Margaret Stiller are actually members of the Citizens' Army, and they actually have guns and they use them in 1916. The rest of the women don't. The women, it's important to remember, Cumann were not actually asked about the plans of the Rising. No member of Cumann was on the planning committee. They weren't told about the delay. They weren't told about the fact it was going to start on a Monday. So there was complete confusion among Cumann, as indeed as the Irish Volunteers themselves, as to when the Rising was happening or if it was happening. And a number of the 4 branches which were present in Dublin at the time did turn up at various places to join, and they were dispersed. And then they discovered on the Monday that it was going ahead. Quite a few of the women went over the barricades, and 40 of them ended up in the GPO. What they were doing in the GPO, some of them were they were cooking, they were doing nursing, and they were carrying dispatches between the various garrisons. Now, if you look at Patrick Pearce there, Countess Markovich was actually she was digging trenches
in the Stephen's Green. There's echoes of World War I there. And then they were busy digging trenches for the Irish Republic. And the British came along on top of the Shelbourne Hotel, and they were shooting down at them, and then they had to remove themselves to the College of Surgeons. If you look at Pearse's feet there, they're kind of strange because there's a woman standing beside him, and she would have been Elizabeth Farley, and she was actually a dispatch rider that Pearse gave the surrender note to, and she went from garrison to garrison to garrison and stood beside him in front of General Lowe. This is the picture of Pearse surrendering to the British, and she was beside him. But because of the way she stood, you can't actually see her, you can just see this sort of feet. And sometimes that picture has been doctored to just show his feet. Right, so there was arrests of 3,226 men after 1916 Rising, of which about 1,500 were released within a fortnight. This is countrywide that these people were, and this of course drove everybody crazy because so many people were lifted and put into prison after 1916, and it antagonised a lot of people. And of course then, within that fortnight, we had the 15 executions that further antagonised the Irish nation, and then you had 2,491 men and 8 women, including Countess Markovich and Kathleen Clark, deported to England. Sorry, Johnny, I'm taking too long. So then, the men are gone. So as the women of Cumann keep the place going. So what is happening in Ireland at that time is that you have a country which has no real social welfare situation. There's no social welfare. There is an old age pension, but it's very inadequate. And the men who have been deported are not eligible for the old age pension. They're young men. They're the only breadwinners. So the women have not been educated to get a job. There's social aid, they're not encouraged to get work. And so they're completely dependent on their menfolk, and they are in England, or they've been executed. So what happens then is, such is the population, it's very hard to explain the impact of 1916 and to go back into that time. The PSCP people were furious, and there was masses all around the country, probably in Borsley as well, for the souls of those who died. Their poetry was being published, their dramas were being published, their plays were being published, like Thomas MacDonagh's plays. And the women of Cumann got together under Kathleen Clark, because she had been left money by Thomas Clark, and they organised themselves, and they decided to collect money for the dependents of those who had sent to England, and also of those who had been executed. And then each branch started collecting money, house-to-house subscriptions, mass subscriptions, and flag days, concerts, and sending food parcels to those in England, and sending clothes as well. And an interesting feature is they were selling cigarettes like crazy, because everybody smoked at that time. They saw nothing wrong with it. Right, so what happens then is, these are the women who were involved in 1916, and this is a picture, but Cumann organised that, and then many of the men were released in the 21st of December from Francock and from Reading Gaol in England, among them a man called Michael Collins, who met up with Kathleen Clark, and he started taking over the National Aid Organisation, and that gave him a lot of context and put him in centre stage to start the next part of the revolution. And then by 1917, all the prisoners had been released, including Countess Markovich, and of course those releases gave fantastic, there was fantastic cheering when these men came back and these women came back. They had gone kind of being booed and jeered in 1916, and there was a huge change in the country when they came back, as you know. Right. Right, so then we move on to 1916 and 17. By 1917 and 18 then, there's a huge rise in Cumann, there's a huge rise in the Sinn Féin clubs, there's a huge rise with the prisoners who have been released. They start reinvigorating Sinn Féin, and they start reinvigorating Cumann as well. And one of the reasons they've started invigorating, particularly I think the Templemore Club starts in around 1918, is because World War I is still on. The British are losing the war, they need men. They brought in conscription in England in 1916, the 1st of January. They did not bring it in Ireland. They now bring it in April 1916. And they say, we're going to give you home rule, you just have to have conscription. Conscription means you have to join the British Army whether you like it or not. A lot of people took that very seriously, and they were actually sandbagging some of their little towns to stop the British coming in and grabbing the young men by force. It didn't happen, but there was a lot of rumours. The whole country shut down for one day's strike in April 1916. There were marches, and Cumann were marching in their uniform, and so were the Irish Volunteers, so was the GAA, so was all the Irish groups were all out protesting against conscription. The whole country, people were signing pledges and everything in 1918, against conscription. And the women of Cumann had their own day, which was called Lawn in 1918, and they had marches in every single town in Tipperary. They had it in Curlis, they had it in Neenah, they had it in Clare, they had it in Clonmel. I didn't find any mention of Borsley. They tended to take a very religious character of the situation. The women would go to Mass, then they would march from the church to some shrine, or some maybe little Marian shrine, singing hymns, and then they would have maybe a benediction with the priest, and then they'd come back and they'd sign the petition, and surrounded by great crowds. So in Nina, they met in the square outside the church, and then they marched to this square then outside the courthouse. And in that little area then, this would have been attended by thousands. And it just showed that Cumann could organise the women of Ireland very effectively. 2/3 of the Irish women as a whole signed that pledge, this anti-conscription pledge, that they were against conscription of the men, and they would not take the jobs. So if the men were bus drivers in the towns, or if they were had any kind of jobs, they weren't going to step in like the English women and take over the jobs. They didn't want them gone. And this is one of the pledges that they took here, this sign, which is in the National Library. Right, we'll go on. Right, so then we move on. So then there's a huge increase in Cumann meetings all across Tipperary and all across parts of East Limerick. The meetings would generally take place after Mass on Sundays, when the women are often empty over. They would take place in a local hall. The president would say their piece, so the secretary would give her report, the treasurer would give her the report, there would be a report from Dublin, and the report then back. And then they were generally had a lot of first aid classes, and there were a lot of religious functions, praying for those who are dead in Ireland. Thomas Ashe, for instance, dies in 1917 from a hunger strike. They have an anniversary mass for him. They have anniversary masses consistently for all of those who died in 1916. So part of it is religious, but part of it is a way of circumventing the laws of the time, because they're preventing from meeting in other ways. So they're using the religious services as a way of protest as well. And then we come up to 1918, which is the general election. This happens then after the end of World War I, and these are just examples of the cheering and the headlines at the time of World War I. Then the posters which will be on the carriages. This picture of De Valera, and they're all cheering for him, and there's a group of women also campaigning for 1918 for Sinn Féin, even though the majority of women could not vote in that election. The vote for women was brought in 1918 only for women that were over 30 years old and had property, not for anyone else. And it was brought in for the men over the age of 21. The property qualification was gone for the men, but it was there for the women. And the women of Cumann were generally 18, 19, 20, in their early 20s. They were under the age of 30, the majority, so they still couldn't vote. But they went and they canvassed and they catered for the IRA, or the Irish Volunteers, it's still called at that time. And they canvassed and they put up posters and they did all the background work to ensure the election of 1918 would go to Sinn Féin. So the election of it was held then in 1918, and you can see the population difference. It had doubled in 1918. I've explained about how the difference of the men and the women. And Sinn Féin got 73 seats. Of the British Parliament. They were allowed to send 105 members to the British Parliament, and they got 73 seats, which was 48% of the overall. The IPP, was the Irish Parliamentary Party, had completely collapsed. Redmond was dead, and there was only 6, and Eunice got 26, only one woman was elected, Countess Markievicz. Because it happened in November 1918, in the 1919 then there was the Paris Peace Convention. The Paris Peace Convention was going to reorganise Europe after the calamity of World War I. It was going to reconstitute mostly Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and reconstruct those countries. So Poland suddenly got independence. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia got independence. The Austrian Empire was shrunk. The Balkans, which was the Ottoman Empire, was all divided up. Britain then got a mandate to go into the Middle East and create Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. And Ireland thought, we're a small country. President Woodrow Wilson said, small countries have a right for self-determination. We want to have our own country. And they had held the Dáil, first Dáil, 3 days before the opening of this Paris Convention. That was why it was held in January. It was also just a month after the general election of 1918. And on the same day then, we had Salahed Beg, and there the 4 leaders of Salahed Beg, known as the Big Four at the time. Same thing happened. Right, now I hope you can read that. This is just a listing of the women who were in Cumann, or the branches of Cumann in the 1st Tipperary Brigade. The 1st Tipperary Brigade is that of North Tipperary. It does not include this area, unfortunately. And what happened in the 1930s was they decided that they would give pensions to the women and the men who had been involved in Cumann and in the IRA and in Fianna Éireann, and in the Free State Army. They had decided to give the pensions in 1924, and in 1934 they brought the women in as well. And they asked the people in Cumann who had been in Cumann, please write up the list of names and the branches that were in the 1st Tipperary Brigade. So a local committee got together and they came up with a list of these branches. They're not complete because there are some branches missing. For instance, there was a branch in Gortigari because it's mentioned, but it's not in this official list. There was a branch in Lara and Dara, but it's not in this list. I was very lucky and I found a list of membership for Boris O'Kane in another part of the archives in Dublin. But it wasn't actually, I got no members. I got members for Boris O'Kane, but not for Lara. Well, I got 3 or 4 for Lara and none for Gortigari. So this is the Lena branch, Tuivara is in it, Ballina is in it, then say, just a second. The 4th Battalion, there was no branches, they're missing. Then we got the Templeterry branches, Templeterry DC is only 1, Newport is only 1, and Roscrea branch is only 1. There's only 1 branch in each one. Right, we'll go on to the second. This then is the 2nd Tipperary Brigade, which is unfortunately this area. And I say that because there seems to be no group, no women to go over listing the branches of the 2nd Tipperary Brigade for Cumann. There are 4 or 5 files to the 2nd Brigade for the IRA, but there is no nominal roles made up for the 2nd Brigade. So I took the branches that were belonging to the IRA for the 2nd Brigade, and you can see here where they're listed. And so we've got Borrisley in the 3rd Battalion for the IRA, but there is none for Cumann. So I had to go through all the branches, all the list of files, and I had to try and find women who are belonging to Borrisley and all these ones. So I ended up with about 77 members who are belong to the 2nd Brigade of Cumann in Tipperary. And I know that's not all of them. They're only the women who applied for the pensions and applied for the medals. Right, we'll go on. This is the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. The 3rd Tipperary Brigade takes over all those areas. I'm sure hopefully you can see it. And you can see there that there's immediately 8 battalions and numerous branches, because it's more stronger in South Tipperary than it is in North Tipperary. And again, if you look at there's a branch there, just say South Tipperary branch, Knockavella, Clonolty, Rossmore, and Carty and Holyford. Unfortunately for those branches, when they put in the returns, they only gave the officers of those branches. There was no full list. Same thing happened with the Dragon branches, and then for the Carrickenshaw branches, no list at all. I had to try and make it up as best I could from the pensions, which is a different section. And again, those lists are not complete. This problem of incomplete records really only applies to Cumann. It does not apply to the IRA. For instance, if I was in Laois, there are absolutely no nominal roles for Cumann in Laois, in Wexford or Waterford, or for Northern Ireland. It's very, very patchy. And for Tipperary it's patchy as well. We've got a complete nominal role list, or nearly complete nominal role list for the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, 1st Tipperary Brigade, but none for the 2nd Tipperary Brigade. There doesn't seem to be a local committee. Right. Okay, so this is the numbers which I think you might be interested in. And you can see there the numbers for the 1st Tipperary Brigade in the IRA, and then that date there, the 11th of July 21, is the date of the truce. And you can see the numbers there for the 2nd Brigade, IRA, say 1,115, and it drops then about 47.1%, there's this decimal point missing there, down to 600 at the 1st of July 22, which started the Civil War. And you can see there the branch, the amount of people are saying they're involved in the IRA. We're getting 2,000, 1,000, 3,000, and a total of 6,525. For Cumann I only get 1,179. Because that's only the 1st Brigade and 3rd Brigade. It does not include the 2nd Brigade. But I think we could say that we have roughly about 2,000 women involved in Cumann in 1921, of which only about 401 applied for a pension, and of which only 25% even get a pension. Right? And again with the men, about only 20% of those men who applied for a pension get a pension as well. Okay. Right, so Cumann duties during the War of Independence, I'm not going to read them out, but I'm going to just talk about them. I'm sure you'll be able to look at them. If you wanted a pension, you had to have military duties. And you can see there that the Cumann duties are mostly non-military. So although there were the majority of those branches, and although the IRA could not participate, could not work without the help of Cumann, because it's a guerrilla war army, they needed accommodation, they needed food, they needed bandages, they needed first aid, they needed people to do jet duties, they needed funeral escorts, they needed all that. They wouldn't have been able to operate without it. They were not included for military duties. They were basically, those duties were sort of dismissed when it came to getting the pensions in the 30s, 40s and 50s. It was the military duties which the people worked at, because they're military pensions. So the women could look at intelligence work. For instance, a woman, Bridget Gill, up in Nina, and her pub, her family premises is opposite the military barracks in Nina. And so they're watching the military going in and out, and they're also getting tips when there's going to be a raid on the various areas like Calais or the silver mines or Nina or any area like around there. And they're watching, and they'll have people maybe inside. For instance, down in Clare, there's another man who actually works in Clare, he's a tradesman and he's bringing in things. And he's tipping off a lady in Cumann when there's going to be a raid. And she explains in her pension, he's not doing that because he loves the movement, he just doesn't want to see bloodshed. The carrying dispatches is important to remember. It took me a while to understand that. The British are in charge of the mail service, postage, sending letters and parcels. But they're also able to open up parcels and post belonging to other people who are not members of ordinary people. So I've got a situation where I have the two principals, one in Islay and one in Calais, and they're both kind of involved at a very low level. One man is in dementia in the IRA. They're very interested in this. The RIC are opening their post because you've published it in one of your books. And they're actually looking at it, and they know exactly who's involved, and they exactly know who to arrest, and who to question, and who to put into jail without trial, and who is involved in all this. So the IRA and the Cumann, they had to think, how are we going to circumvent this? So they're their own way of sending information, and it was by hand. So somebody would write a hand piece, or would maybe type up a piece of letter using carbon copy, and that was called a dispatch, and that would be passed on from woman to woman to woman. One woman would, so it starts up in Dublin, and it was kind of a line down from Dublin, down to Tipperary, down to Cork, and then up again. And it was very, very effective. So they would leave these dispatches, this piece of information, in a particular Skull Frida up in St. Stephen's Green up in Dublin. One woman would take it 10 miles, she passed to another woman for 10 miles, another one for 10 miles, and all the way down to the end. And then the dispatches would go up. Limerick Junction was an area where a lot of dispatches were kept, and I mentioned all that in my book. And the postmasters, or the railway men, were bringing the dispatches up and down. They were travelling from Dublin and bringing it up and down. And there was a bookseller, it was a Margaret Fruin, at a bookseller in Limerick Junction, and she was facilitating the sending of dispatches. But it's hand delivering. And then there's carrying and storing ammunition and weapons. They're bringing them to the sites, they're picking them up after the ambush, because no one is going to stop a woman. They have long dresses, they can hide guns, they can put them in their prams, they can carry them under their coats. They're able to do that. And they're also looking after the weapons, they're caring for the weapons, they're oiling them, they're cleaning them, and they're handing out to the men. And that was their military duties. And they had a bicycle corps. The types of transportation is walking, bicycling, and going by train, horse and trap. Some of them are bringing a turf from the bog, and the guns are hid under the hay or hid under the turf. And in all these ways, they're contributing to the War of Independence and contributing to activities of a guerrilla army. Right. Okay, so these are the raids and rallies, which are a very important part of the Irish War of Independence, and you can see there the number of raids. When we say 38,000 raids in a year and a half, we're talking about 7 or 8 military lorries, or 4 or 5 military lorries coming out from Templemore, coming out from Nina, and going into an area, usually at night time, and attacking a number of houses, and they knew exactly where to go. They weren't getting lost up in the hills of Hollyford, forget it. They knew where to go. And then they would go into a house, they'd bash the door down, they'd look for somebody, take out the men, push the women out of the way, and just wreck the house. And in many cases, the place sometimes could be even burned down, especially when there was reprisals. There was a military convoy down the Thomastown ambush, down very close where I lived when I was a girl, and they were members of the Northampton Regiment, which were based in Templemore, that were actually attacked and died in the Thomastown ambush. So then 14 houses were selected around the Thomastown area to be burned out as a result of those men's deaths. Okay, so if you look at the deaths in the Civil War then, these are just pictures of what the lorries would have looked like, pictures of the black and tans there with their Gortigari caps on them, and they're holding somebody up. These are the women who would be protesting again. They were usually outside the prisons at the time, saying the rosary, holding up posters, praying for the dead. And again, it's a type of political protest, but it's couched in a religious setting, so they're not going to be arrested. And you can see the deaths there in order during the War of Independence. And notice that Cork has the most, Tipperary is the 5th, and Antrim is not really involved in the War of Independence, but there are sectarian riots happening in Belfast, and that's why that number is so high. Right, 1921, I hope you can see that. Generally, there's a general election, and again, Sinn Féin rises to the fore. We have 6 women listed there that become the 6 TDs. I'm not even sure if we're 6 TDs now, but anyway, we're 6 TDs then. And Countess Markovich is one of them, and that lady up there is Mary McSweeney, who was a sister to Terence McSweeney, who died on hunger strike in 1920. Now, because of, by the 11th of July 1921, there was a truce. The truce happened after the creation of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was over and done with. Their parliament had opened before the truce in 1920. But there was so much devastation, so many people made homeless, there was no social welfare. Irish America got together, and Mary McSweeney was very helpful in that, as were Cumann, as was Maura Comerford. And they started up in America this Irish White Cross, because the Red Cross was considered to be a British organisation, so then the White Cross, which was a humanitarian organisation. And they collected $5 million in America, from all Irish America. John McCormack was a great singer. He held a number of concerts to raise money for this organisation, the Irish White Cross. A number of, I have a nice little book on it which I picked up, and there's a huge amount of senators involved. They were recommended people. The President of the United States had changed. His name was President Hoover. He asked that people would contribute to it. The cardinals all across are all Irish Americans. They're all contributing it and exhorting people to contribute. And so they ended up with $5 million. And that is a picture of Ireland, if you like, and the Ireland represented this woman looking for help. And this then was distributed through the parish system, through the parish priests. And then in 1921, Cumann had a training camp where they went through the organisation's mottos, and they did things like signalling and drilling, which would be marching, and also then updated their knowledge of first aid and so on. As during the truce, then a lot of the men had training camps, because the rest of the country thought we were at peace, but the IRA and Cumann were saying this is temporary, it could come back, we're going to prepare in case war breaks out again. And then in 6th of December we went to the treaty. So then the aftermath of the treaty divided everybody, because some people felt that they had, I was talking to a woman during the week, and she said her father was in the IRA and he believed that he had sworn in the Bible for an Irish Republic, not a free state. The Free State was only what was it. When De Valera went over in July 1920, the British were not going to recognise an Irish Republic. They had an empire. It was the biggest it was ever going to be. If they'd recognised an Irish Republic at that time, then it was going to give ideas and encouragement to the Indians, the Indian people in the continent of India. They wanted to be free. It was also going to encourage the Egyptians. So they wanted to keep Ireland within the empire. And so the treaty was basically keeping Ireland within the empire, was splitting the country in two. People were also not particularly interested in that, because they felt that the subject of Northern Ireland would be dealt with in the Boundary Commission at a later date. So the treaty really was about a form of words. They said it was the Republic or it was an anti-treaty. Now the people of Ireland had a number of years of violence. 1916 with all of the mass arrests. 1917 there was mass arrests again, 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921. They just want peace. The ordinary people just want peace. But the elite of the IRA and the elite of Cumann, they were fighting, they would have seen it differently, and they basically both organisations split. Cumann then had a special convention on 5th February 1922 where the majority decided that they would be against the treaty. Those who left, a number of women who were, like Jenny Wise-Power, who were founder members of Cumann, actually left that case and founded their own women's organisation called Cumann Saoirse, which only lasted about a year and a half. It was a pro-treaty organisation, and it was helping in a very traditional way the Free State government, the Free State provisional government for the election of 1922 and 23, and then it dissolved in 23. There's very little information about it except there appears to be in a branch. There was definitely a branch in Thurles, and there was a branch in Clonmel, and they tried to start a branch in Tipperary Town, except that lady was literally hunted back to Dublin, put on the train, forcibly put on the train, and not allowed to have a vote, and not allowed to speak, and set up a branch in Tipperary town. And there appears to have been a branch in Thurles. If you look at the numbers of Cumann officially with 17,000 members of Cumann at the start of the War of Independence, or at the start of the truce, that possibly is as big as 25,000 because such a lack of full records. And then we're down to 12,000, which possibly could be as high as 16 or 17,000 for the Civil War. The women still do those military duties and non-military duties in the Civil War as in the War of Independence. And they are strongest in Kerry, Tipperary, and Mayo and Wexford. Right, so the Civil War then happens. It starts with a very big bang, if you like, with the Four Courts explosion and the fighting in Dublin, with Liam Lynch, Collins and Cosgrave, who are main characters at the time at the Civil War. And up there then we have the Conall Brugha, who was killed during the Battle of Dublin in July 1923, and his wife Kathleen Brugha asked the Cumann march in their uniform. This is the times that they would actually wear their uniform. When they're doing their duties around the country, they're not wearing a uniform, but they would wear it at funerals, and they were escort there for his funeral, and that's a picture of that as his coffin is going into Glasnevin Cemetery. Right, it's the Civil War divisions. I just thought this was interesting, and you'll probably recognise the church as Eileen Church. And I found this extremely interesting because it just shows the division. Here we have the church, and in the front of the church we have the Small family grave. And Michael Small was the commandant in the Free State Army. He died in the late 1920s. And then behind the church we have the Republicans, 3 men out of the 4 who were executed in Roscrea. There was, during the Civil War, which I'm not discussing, just mentioning, during the Civil War, after the death of Collins, if you look at the newsreels of Collins, just to mention it, you will see a huge army procession of all the Free State men, army, marching after Collins' funeral. And then you'll see women marching in a uniform like this. They're not members of Cumann, they're members of Cumann Saoirse. But this graveyard and this church just shows the divisions. That after Collins, then by November, there was a decision made by the Free State government that anyone who had a weapon could be executed. And this is what happened to those 3, O'Shea, Burke and the other man then, after the War of Independence, in the Civil War. They were executed in Roscrea because the military barracks in Roscrea was reopened during the Civil War, and 3 of them are buried in Eileen. And I just think it shows the division in the country very effectively. So during the War of Independence, only 50 women had actually been arrested because it wasn't considered proper to arrest women. But by the time the Civil War happened, those who had been involved in the War of Independence were very aware of the role that women had played during the War of Independence, and the gloves were off. There was now equal treatment, equality for all. So you ended up with about 13,000 men in jail, and there was 645 women. And we know that from the prison registers and from their graffiti and from some of their own accounts. At one stage, Cumann jail had actually been closed before 1916, then it was closed again, and then it was reopened again. Because it was a very old jail. They had candles in part of the jail, they had no electricity, it was damp. The women, when they were in the jail, they decided to continue the Civil War within the jail, so they broke all the windows. They didn't cooperate in any form or fashion. And then, of course, Mary McSweeney had gone on hunger strike in Mountjoy. She was released, and she was actually arrested in Limerick Junction Station on her way to Liam Lynch's funeral, and she ended up back in Cumann jail, and she went on hunger strike again. And she ended up on 25-day hunger strike. There was another earlier hunger strike with the women for 1 week in April 1923 as well. She was quite a lot. So Mary McSweeney had done 2 hunger strikes in 1922 and in 1923. She got huge publicity in 1922 because everyone said we can't have her dying because her brother died on hunger strike in 1920. But by 1923, the population are kind of very tired of the Civil War and they're getting on with their lives, but these women and these men are in jail without trial and without any release date, and they're still continuing on the Civil War, but they're a minority. Kathleen O'Callaghan is the widow of Michael O'Callaghan, who had been the Mayor of Dublin, Mayor of Limerick, and he'd been murdered in 1921. And these 2 women had actually been TDs in the Dáil of 1921, and here they are now Republican prisoners. And I've read just the female commemoration of Easter week was just the women, James Connolly's daughter and Grace Guilford were actually in jail for Easter 1923, and there was a big commemoration service for the event of 1916 held by the women in 1923. There was a ceasefire in 1923, and I found it very interesting. There was huge crowds for attending the Dublin Horse Show at the time. So the rest of the country was moving on and acting in a very normal fashion, but these ladies are still in jail. And then there was a huge hunger strike of 8,000 men, about 8,000 men, in November 1923, October 1923 to November 1923, of which 51 women take part. And the women do a hunger strike for 25 days, the men do 41 days, and the bad joke at the time was that they did better than our Lord in the desert. He did 40 days fasting, they did 41. And eventually the women are released by December 23, as are September 23, and the men are released by December, and the rest of the country has really moved on, but they haven't. Right. So that's my particular book. I will just talk about the military pensions briefly. They start in 1934 for the women, and the women keep applying until 1955. There's different acts which are passed in those years, especially one around the 1950s, where you're given a special allowance which acted as a substitute pension. I just explained there that my book is the narrative, which I've just done for 200 pages, and the rest of them are 7 appendices. These appendices are the nominal rolls, which list all the branches and who's in the branches, as I showed earlier on. The major part of the book then is a summary of the pension applications from Tipperary and partly from East Limerick, which is Appendix 3. And then I had to try and reinvent those branches, particularly of the 2nd Brigade, of which this is a member of those branches, try and reconstitute those branches from the pensions in Appendix 4. And then the next 2 appendices are East Limerick pension applications and medal applications, service medal applications, and also then pension applications, some pension applications from East Limerick. This is what the military pension service looked like, and this is just a very brief synopsis of the military acts. First act is brought in 1924. Only those who had taken part in the Irish Free State Army could apply for a pension. Then De Valera and Fianna Fáil came in 1932, and they widened it in 1934 to take in Free State veterans, IRA veterans, and Cumann and those in Fianna Éireann. And then the applications run for those years, mostly up to 53, but some in 55. You have 82,000 applications altogether, of which 66,000 are refused. There's only 15,000 successful. I would consider the reason for that is because the country is very, very poor and is very much nearly bankrupted after the Civil War, and there isn't very much money. About 1,000 women are successful, and then they bring out this idea of a medal, that you can get a medal for. You can go on to the next one, Johnny. If you go on to the next one. Yeah, they're the numbers for coming on. I'm not sure if you can see them. I have discussed it already. So that you have the 3 Tipperary brigades, only nominal roles for 1st and 2nd Brigade, and how many branches are in it. So I've got 401 pension applications for Tipperary, and interestingly enough, 280 of them were women who took part on the anti-treaty side. Of the whole 401 pensions, 242 are successful. Then they brought in this idea that you could get a medal, a service medal for your participation in the War of Independence and the Civil War. And if you got the medal, you might have been refused a pension, but you could get a medal. And if you got the medal, then you could apply for a thing called a special allowance, which then got you some money in lieu of the pension. And it turned out that the women who got the special allowance actually got more money than the women who had gone and filled in the 27 pages for the pension. Women were confined, the pensions was graded, like Dan Breen got £336 of a pension because he had been a combatant. But the women were confined, the ordinary members were confined to grade E, as were a majority of the men. And at that time in the 1930s, you got £5 per year, which would have bought quite a bit, but not a lot. And then if you were grade D, then you were a captain of a branch, or of a battalion of a number of branches. And this is the last one. This is a picture of the medal, and this is a list of some of the bursary pension claimants that I have found. And that's the end of the lecture. And I will tell you about them. If I could just say about, there's just 2 or 3 little women there, if I could just talk about. There are no service medal claimants that I could find. But I did find, just a minute now, Mary Ellen Hogan was a former president of Ballywilliam branch, she married here. And then Winifred O'Doherty, I always find her very upsetting because she was involved in Salahead. She moved down here to live with her sister. That woman spent her dowry in the Civil War. feeding the men, because when the men would come in, they had to be fed. The numbers are incredible. They're feeding 15 men, 20 men, 30 men at a time in their houses. And it was all put on tick. And then after the Civil War, those bills had to be paid. And that woman paid, she said in her pension application, and she didn't get a pension, that she actually used quite a lot of her dowry to fund that bill. And she ended up living then in Borrisley with her sister and her married sister and her husband. But I just thought it was quite sad. And there's a lot of sad stories in this book, that health will come down, farms sold, families destroyed, brothers shot, people never getting over it. It's a huge amount of traumatic stress in all of it. So thank you very much.
Noreen, thank you very much. That was most informative and